My name is Lucky Michael. I'm a program officer with Arlene and Michael Rosen Foundation. I also chair Funders Together to End Homelessness with San Diego with Amy. And back in May of this year, and I believe Sean and others attended in 2022, there's various leaders in the housing justice and homeless response sector that went to Vienna to do a field study on Vienna social housing program. Next slide, Amy. So again, in partnership with GPLA, myself, along with our speakers today, Sean Spear, CEO of Community Housing Works, Lahala Maddox, COO with Regional Task Force on Homelessness, Amy Denthart, no stranger to this group, with Funders Together, and myself, were all able to participate in the field study, which lasted about a week. And we were able to visit various sites and have discussions with facilitators from local government and housing developers. Thank you. So Vienna's social housing system is actually supported by a 1% tax split between the salaries of all Viennese residents and employers. Social housing provides both affordable housing to low and moderate income individuals through government and limited profit organizations. Roughly 53% of rental apartments in Vienna are all classified as social housing, which accommodates about 60% of the city's population. And Amy will get into that in the next slide. And Vienna describes social housing sort of into these three categories: municipal housing, which is developed, owned, and master leased by the city and serves the lowest income residents with the greatest need, and holds a current portfolio of over 200,000 units, excuse me. The second is limited profit housing, which is developed by private entities or private developers with regulated profit margins focused on maintaining the affordability of the units. And in that portfolio, there's about 185,000 units. And lastly, gentle urban renewal, which is older buildings that just need a little TLC that are preserved and rehabbed also by government assistance. And next slide, Amy.
So why Vienna? So GPLA, which is the Global Policy Leadership Academy, which is part of Lessard Development Consultants, who many of you know. They developed this tour last year in 2022. Lucky Lahela and I were in the third cohort. Sean was in the first cohort last year. And why Vienna? So Vienna has been seen, social housing is now getting a lot of traction as a movement, as not only the US has a housing crisis that we especially feel acutely here on the West Coast, but the entire world is going through a housing crisis. And so Vienna has had social housing for 100 years, and they're seen as a global model for social housing. Many communities across the world have done subsidized and public housing for years, but a lot of them sold their public housing in the 80s or defunded, which we actually did as well, and shifted to other models. Vienna never sold their public housing. So they still have, as like he said, over 200,000 units of public housing. And then they've added the limited profit housing, which is subsidized. So Vienna's had social housing for over 100 years, and they're ranked on several indices as one of the most livable cities in the world. Nobody in Vienna pays more than 27% of their net income on rent, and that includes market rate. So because there's such an influx of supply of social housing, it actually has caused market rate development rents to actually be maintained at a lower level as well. And so people in Vienna are not rent burdened, as we see here in San Diego, where many of our renters in San Diego are paying over 50% of their income on rent. And so by being able to pay less than 27% on rent, they have obviously the disposable income to be enjoying their lives a little bit more. Maybe they get to go to the theater or a family vacation, or people get to put food on the table for their children, that sort of thing. So they're seen as one of the most livable cities in the world. As like you said, 60% of the residents are in social housing. The vast majority of Viennese, whether market rate or social housing, do rent. There aren't very many homeowners in Vienna, actually. And the city of Vienna is a little bit larger than San Diego, 1.9 million people, to city of San Diego having 1.4 million. Our county obviously is about 1 million, but the city is about 1.4, a little bit smaller than Vienna. And to compare their investments, the city of Vienna, based on the 1% tax that Lucky talked about, and some income from rentals from the vast social housing network that they have, they actually spend about $470 million per year on social housing, compared to the city of San Diego, which spends about $13 million a year on affordable. And that $13 million is not out of the city's general fund. That $13 million is pass-through dollars from the federal government and some of the housing impact fees that developers pay. So you can see there's a vast difference in terms of the investment that Vienna makes in affordable housing compared to San Diego. And I will let Sean, Lahela talk about what it looks like.
So part of what we learned during this trip is, of course, the mechanics and the history, but it's also really about how Vienna has created this structure. Obviously, as Amy said, it goes back 100 years, and it's really about their frame of mind and how they view their citizens and their responsibility as a city. And so, as Amy said, they're known as a city with outstanding quality of life. But this has really been due to decades of, consistent work and planning and really looking ahead to what their citizens need. They look at, and so these lists here are things that they have consistently looked at and consider when they are looking at developing housing or the needs of their community. So they really focus on a quality of life that's a combination of larger factors like the labor market, fair pay, opportunities for engagement and personal development, education and training options. So really, again, looking at a good work-life balance throughout their housing structure. And so they do this through a variety of ways. They have mixed income communities, which means that you may have someone in one of the housing options that makes, way more money than other people, but they believe in having social mixing, both culturally, financially, so that there isn't sort of this, one particular area that's for the super rich and one particular area that's for the super poor. Like you will have a mix of housing, what it looks like, what people's, backgrounds are, income levels are. There's just a mixture of that really anywhere you go. They also really focus on retail and small businesses. So a lot of their newer developments also have retail within them. And so it's a portion of, residential and then a portion of retail. And that's also a community like a community partnership on what type of retail. They're very strategic in their planning. When they develop housing, they look at, is there transportation? And you'll see that at the last bullet point, they focus on public transportation, ensuring that it's installed first. They ensure that there is the ability for people to work in the community that they live in. And they believe in having 50% green space. So in this photo, you see a lot of green, and we saw that almost everywhere we went. There were large fields, places for people to play and gather, and children were out. I even asked our tour person, I was like, there's a lot of kids out, like, is school over? Because this was the end of May. And she said, no, school doesn't end for another 6 to 7 weeks, but all of their in-class learning is done. Their grading is done. And so now they're just out in the community, exploring the world, putting into practice things that they've learned in the classroom. It's an opportunity for parents to engage too. So it was the teachers out there with them, but parents are also welcome. In the evening when we were walking around, just the parks were covered with people and families. And so I think it's really important to talk about this too, because while you have all of the other things, finance and structure and all of those things, it also is about the mindset of Vienna. They also have a smart climate city strategy. So in 2020, they adopted this strategy to reach climate neutrality by 2040. And really sort of one of their quotes is, Vienna can only become a smart model climate city if we engage people and give everyone an equal chance to participate. So they really sort of see, right, housing is a human right. And that's just how they operate. That's their first frame of thought. They have 3 pillars around their smart city, which is a high quality of life for everyone, and that starts with housing for them. A resource conservation, so they believe that where life is good, you can have a good life, but not at the expense of the environment or future generations. And they really look at social and technical innovations to ensure that they can realize their goals. They really are trying to position themselves internationally as a city that people look towards, as they recognize that the climate crisis becomes a social and economic crisis, especially for children and older adults, and then, of course, impacting their housing. And so a couple of examples just of how they believe that structure, in sort of crosses all paths is like they have greenhouse student housing. So they developed a 300 unit student residence, which we were able to visit. And they use things like photovoltaic technology. I don't know what all that means, but like they have like natural light coming in, and they don't have AC, but they have other like ways to cool the building. And the student housing is open all year round. It doesn't close when school is out. They believe they have an obligation to still provide student housing. They also have a timber residential building, which has over 200 apartments and 8 retail shops. So it's mixed use, and it's built out of higher sustainability products. And so the residents are part of that. Like they give the feedback, they architecturally help design it. They don't own it, but it's sort of like a so they don't own it, but they're invested in it, if that makes sense. And so it's a collective group that comes together to develop that housing and what's going to be in that housing. And so I think that's me. That's this part. I'm going to pass it over to Sean. Next slide. Sorry.
Thanks, Laila. Yeah, so during our cohort, which was the first one, we spent quite a bit of time touring many of the developments and communities that were built this way. And however, there was, I think, a core group of us that were, I wouldn't say we were skeptical, but we definitely wanted to dive deep into how exactly is this housing being built? And most importantly, how is it being financed? How is it being brought to the table in terms of providing this resource to a huge swath of the Vienna community? So through a combination of some of the presentations and frankly asking some pointed questions of the government officials that were supporting the creation of the housing, there was also a lot of discussions with the specialists that we were exposed to from time to time during the course of the tours over the week that we were there. From that, we were able to flesh out that the way that these developments are typically structured is that it's, as Laila and Amy were mentioning earlier, it's varying income levels, so it's truly kind of mixed income, generally around a third being for extremely low income folks. And each project may vary in terms of its ratios and its AMI restrictions, but in general, you have 1/3 that's for extremely low, so people making approximately 30 to 40% of area median income. You then have a middle strip of 1/3 that's for kind of a moderate rate. So those may be folks at between 80 and 100% of the area median income. And then the last strip being for sometimes restricted up to as much as 180% of the area median income, or sometimes not restricted at all. Key elements of this that we think that we were able to uncover is that you want to think of this actually as a kind of classic NGO model, where you have a governmental entity that sort of sets the stage for a nonprofit sector to be able to do community benefiting work. So it's really a partnership between government, the nonprofit developers, and housing associations. There's oftentimes kind of community groups that are participating in the development of this housing. And then lastly, as Lahela mentioned actually earlier, there's a resident component in terms of the fact that even though it's rental housing, the residents are putting in a down payment on this. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that in the Q&A. So as I mentioned, variety of income levels. What's unique is that you income certify when you move in and then never again. So regardless of where your incomes may go, even though you may change jobs and you may go higher or lower in your income levels, you're not recertifying. If people have a challenge in terms of meeting the rent, so for instance, if they may lose their job or they may go to a lower paying job and can't make the rent, there is a rental subsidy that's readily available to them. So you have a component of the extremely low income units may have a rental subsidy at times, but otherwise the rental subsidy is there kind of as a backstop in case somebody has a substantial downturn in their income. So it kind of makes sure that people are not forced out for economic reasons as a result of that. Other elements is that, the government really focuses on not just being on the front end in terms of rezonings and land assembly, but also in terms of the construction itself. So what you find there is that there's lots of land assembly, similar to what redevelopment agencies did here in California for many years. But also they are focused on making sure that the cost of the construction itself is somewhat subsidized. So it's a combination of three things. First, almost all of, but not all, but pretty close to all of the social housing is developed using concrete, not wood, as you may find primarily here in California. The government then controls and subsidizes the concrete itself. So it's a very cheap cost for that building material. Secondly, there is what I was calling prevailing wage for all. The government regulates the construction labor industry and regulates the wages that they charge. And then lastly, of course, is essentially providing free land for the development. In addition to that, the government provides subordinate governmental loans for the projects, similar to what we do here. But those loans get repaid over time. It tends to be a lower amount per unit than what you see here because the overall cost of the projects are lower. There's also then the nonprofits who may build up equity in the developments or put in equity initially that then grows with the value of the property, so that when they come back and rehabilitate and refinance the deals, then they're often realizing a payout in terms of equity. That equity must be then provided into additional projects as sort of a community benefit. So the nonprofits themselves are acting as the investor in new development as well. And it is unheard of. We had one deal where they were pointing out the nonprofit involved brought in $35 million of their own money, essentially for helping to subsidize the development of that project. Last point I want to make is that also, as I mentioned earlier, the residents are coming up with a down payment. It's generally 1% to 2% of their income. That also grows with the value of the property, so that when it is eventually refinanced, there may be a return for them as well. So it's almost like a limited equity co-op. They don't necessarily own land, but they effectively own a note with their down payment that comes into the property. We can go to the next slide. So all of these sources together, kind of the governmental subsidy, they do use private financing, at least for debt, the maximum amount that the project can support. There's then that subordinate governmental loan, and then there's the down payment from the residents. Collectively, all of that is about $470 million per year, as Amy was mentioning earlier. About 80% of that goes into new construction or rehabilitations. About 20% goes into rental assistance, like I was mentioning, which is really like gap assistance in terms of residents if they need it. They also generate, so of that 470 million, there's also a portion of it, 1% of, in terms of income tax that everybody is charged. So there's in effect a special tax for housing production. And then the rest of the 230 million is in the form of loan repayments to the government, which again get recycled into new projects, and also a fairly minimal amount of ground lease payment that the projects also may pay to the government for that. I think that covers my part for now.
Okay, great.
Yep, I'll turn it back over to Amy. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So because Vienna is such a great place to live, it's growing rapidly. They're growing at 11 to 12% a year. So that creates a bit of a challenge for the government in terms of housing production. So in recognizing this, in the 80s, they developed a semi-private public-private partnership that is called Von Wien. I don't remember the translation of that, but essentially it's a public-private partnership. And they were developed in order to acquire land. Project population would be 15 years in advance. So they're doing a 15-year projection in order to purchase the land and bank the land in order to have future development, in order to be keeping up with the demand of the population. Sometimes this land, so we saw a couple of these parcels. Sometimes the land is on the perimeter. The one in the picture is a large development called Seestadt, and it is actually used to be an old airport. So they redeveloped that land. One of the neat things they did is they put in the metro system before the development went in. So they set up the public transportation. But so that's an example of a very large project. They have you can see the lake. They have a lake in the middle of this project. They have a mixed use of there's subsidized housing, there's market rate housing, there's cooperative housing, there are schools, there are grocery stores, there's a lake, there's transit, all of that. They're thinking of all of that as they're developing these large parcels. And as I said, they bank this land and they're looking at a 15-year projection in terms of when they're going to start developing land. Another one that we saw was actually more toward the city center. And you think, how are you going to get large parcels of land in the city center? It was actually a rail yard. So it's right next to the train station, but it's just where they stored the old rail cars, or rail cars not in use. So they moved the rail cars out to the perimeter, and they took that large parcel of land that's very close to the city center, and they developed that land. So they do this kind of land banking. And then they actually, when they are going to develop it, they have the land acquisition. The land acquisition itself is based on the city's development plan. So they work closely, even though they are public-private partnership, they're working closely with the city in terms of their development plan and in terms of zoning. In 2019, they recognize, we all struggle with inclusionary, right? What percentage of our properties are going to be inclusionary? They recognize this, and in 2019, they worked with the city to pass what they call a subsidized housing zoning category. So any of this newly acquired land that's going to be put on the market for residential has to be 2/3 social housing. When they have these large parcels, Von Wien also oversees developer competitions. So they have a developer competition, which in this case, several developers competed to see what the overall development would look like. And the one that won the development was the one that put this fantastic swimming lake right in the middle of the development. And then the developer will go and have individual competitions for each of the buildings that you're seeing there. And so you get a wide variety of type, you get a variety of architecture, but the overall development plan for the region is done by that developer that won the bid. Sean, do you have any more on this?
Yeah, because it's kind of an interesting thing. Not only is it in terms of what may have been governmentally owned property that then gets repurposed for housing, but it also comes into play when they do essentially greenfield rezonings. So something that may have been agricultural use or light industrial use in times past and is under private ownership, they are capturing the value of a zoning change for social housing. So if they, for instance, rezone an area and upzone it substantially, that means that the value of those properties is going up substantially. They are then saying, well, no, you can capture 1/3 of that value. You can sell it for market rate housing if you want or whatever you may, but 2/3 of it must go to social housing. So it's really an equitable kind of approach to this and saying, yes, landowner, you're going to get a benefit from the government deciding to rezone, and you're going to be able to have, an opportunity to develop it, but you need to do something that's going to be of community benefit as part of it.
Thank you, Amy. So Vienna does actually have what's similar to what we call support services or supportive housing services, which is led actually by local government, and that department is called Wohnservice Wien. Check out my German accent today, and Lahella's going to keep me accountable because then I'm going to butcher everything that comes next. But yeah, Wohnservice Wien is the municipal department that supports access to social housing, providing conflict resolution services, community engagement opportunities, and legal protections. So within Wohnservice Wien, there are 3 other departments, and Lahella, keep me accountable here. Wohnberatung Wien, which focuses on housing navigation and lease up, and Wohnpartner, which focuses on community service and tenant engagement, Mieterhilfe, which focuses on tenant assistance and legal counsel. The city of Vienna is immediately notified whenever a resident is given an eviction notice, and also provides rental subsidy to prevent the person from experiencing eviction. And additionally, and this is pretty important to note, that 90% of court-filed cases do not actually result in evictions in Vienna because of strong tenant protections and mediation that's provided through Wohnservice Wien. So as Lahella mentioned earlier, social mixing, individuals from various socioeconomic backgrounds do get to live in the same neighborhood. And of course that improves inclusion and reduces concentration of poverty. I'm not going to spend too much time on the Chamber of Labor and Chamber of Commerce. The most important key takeaways for both of them is the Chamber of Labor works in partnerships with local universities to advance housing research. They also have a team that supports tenants in court. All employees in Vienna must be registered with the Chamber of Labor, and they primarily focus on improving working conditions and ensuring affordable housing. And the Chamber of Commerce, through trade promotion, supports stronger economic development, which of course goes into further development of housing opportunities. They also represent 500,000 member companies, so somewhat similar to our chamber, except for they also prioritize affordable housing. Ding, ding, no shade. Or I guess that's shade. The most important thing that I do want to get into is the unhoused population in Vienna. Unlike the United States, we have the annual census count, obviously led by Regional Task Force. Vienna does not do a census count, and it's actually really difficult to get an accurate read as to how many people are experiencing homelessness or are unsheltered. It is an approximate, which is about 2,700 people are unsheltered. Some of the leading causes of homelessness include, similar to the US, unemployment, financial hardships, relationship issues, co-occurring disorders, and medical challenges. Access to shelter, mind you, it said 2,700 people at any given time might be experiencing homelessness. Access to shelter is based on, unfortunately, residency status. So in order for people to gain access to shelter services, there's certain thresholds that must be met. The person must be unhoused, demonstrate that they became unhoused in Vienna with proof of their last rental agreement within the city boundaries. They also have to be an Austrian citizen or a European Union citizen or have a long-term residency visa. Austrian citizens only need to provide income or social security proof, and EU citizens need to provide income proof. Asylum seekers can have opportunity for temporary housing until their cases are decided. That is also pending availability. In the colder months, Vienna has about 900 beds available, and anyone can access without having to meet the threshold. However, in the winter months, only those who meet all of those requirements or thresholds can actually access shelter services. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, those are some of the challenges, as you clearly, like people who are from the global South, immigrants are not able to be provided services. And despite the city's best efforts and all the wonderful people that we did speak to, we also heard and sadly got to experience that there are some far-right extremism that is continuing on in Vienna. There is a culture, unfortunately, of anti-Blackness, a long-standing history of anti-Semitism, which we all know about, Islamophobia and xenophobia. Unfortunately, Vienna does not have sufficient data on demographics, so it's really hard to understand what population is coming from where. Excuse me. And there are not enough temporary housing units for also workers. So people who come out to Vienna to actually construct some of the buildings from other European nations may not have access to temporary housing. There is opportunity to rent efficiency units, but the cost burden goes back to the worker. And again, there's just not enough supply to support that population. Also, pathways to citizenship is extremely challenging. Austria is one of the hardest countries to gain citizenship and legal residency, and Vienna's naturalization process the rate, is far below 1%. And foreign nationals above age 16 years old, which accounts for about 30% of the population, are also denied voting rights, which of course impacts democratic deficit in local, regional, and national elections. And then Hella, please feel free to chime in and share from your experience if you'd like. But as you can see, there's a beautiful, lovely crowd here in this photo. The woman in the blue is a well-known activist and organizer. Her name is Nomi Ayanu, and she's also was featured in the New York Times article, Renters Utopia, sans the Utopia piece for this section, of course. And the makeup of this group here, let me start again and say that our foundation hosted a dinner to hear directly from Nomi, her perspective and her insights as someone who is, I think, third generation Viennese. And what she shared, before we even got to sit down, we were racially attacked and accosted, and in such a disruptive and aggressive manner that the restaurant owners had to come and usher people out of the restaurant. It was quite the production. And once folks' nervous system started to settle again, and we were able to reintroduce calm and re-engage in the conversation, some of the things that she shared with us were a bit alarming and contradictory to some of the things that we learned from the facilitators. And they are that she herself had experienced housing preclusion based on her last name. Her father actually had to leave Vienna due to racism. And as of late, she's also had to move out. And so I don't want this information to overshadow the fact that this social housing, the model itself works and is efficient, but in these issues of racism is not, of course, unique to Vienna, as we know that we're experiencing that right here at home. But just want to be honest a little bit about that experience. And Lahela, please feel free to chime in if you have anything else to add.
No, I think you covered it well, but as like you said, there it was just sort of interesting, the response as well, of the community, and sort of glossing over it. Like there was an apology the next day from, I think we were at the Chamber of Labor or Commerce, and they were like, this is not how we are. But at the same time, as like you said, they have a really hard time because they don't record demographics. They don't, there's a lot of things that they don't do, and they don't know, and they don't understand about their community. And so it's sort of like, if we don't see it, right, it doesn't exist. And so that isn't a topic of conversation like it is here in the US, in Vienna. So that was sort of our experience around that.
Exciting.
Oh, so this is me. So there are other types of housing we've talked a little bit about, so I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on some of them. And so a couple types of housing that they have, there are smart apartments. I relate them sort of to like the single, SROs here in the US, though they see them as a very viable option of housing. A lot of their newer housing are smart apartments in which they're efficient floor plans, so it keeps the rents low. And they're really prioritized for smaller households like senior citizens, single parents, and young people who are just starting out. So again, it's a nice unit. It sort of meets everything. People can afford it, but it certainly isn't, large and extravagant. And so that's sort of how they address some of their housing needs as well. They also, which we talked a little bit about, they have owner cooperatives there. And so this picture here is one of those. And they are self-financed, cooperatively owned residential buildings that are eligible for subsidies. And so really how it works, we saw two types. One is what's called bikes and rails. And so it's formed by collectives with shared interests. So like for the bikes and rails, it's people who live without cars. And so in this building, the bottom floor is a bike shop. You can rent bikes, you can buy bikes, you can repair bikes. They have like a coffee shop and a little bar. We were able to interview or meet with residents of different types of housing there, and then above it is the housing that cooperative has designed. I visited the one that was a group of families, particularly architecture folks, who they then designed the building, the structure, the flats, and part of that, the bidding or the competition that the city holds is what types of retail are you going to do? How are you going to support the community that you live in? What types of businesses are you going to bring in? So if it's family oriented. So that particular complex is built in which the houses or apartments are smaller, but movable. So they are expandable. So for example, like they have two bedroom units next to each other. If one family was to leave that unit, the family next to it, if it became available, could move into that unit and expand their unit into like a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom. The units are reconfigurable, which I thought was interesting. And it's because they use then community spaces. So like at the top of the building, they have a large community kitchen and dining area, a large playroom. So you don't have to have, a playroom and toys in your apartment. You can all go, individually or as a group. They have, group laundry, they have a group garden. So it's really the collective group's interest in what they want to develop, music classes, shared babysitting, like sort of all different things that they have. And then it also, as Sean talked a little bit about this, and so the unique thing about like the owner cooperatives is like, they don't own it per se, but they've put a deposit and they're invested in it. It's like a share kind of, and you might be able to explain it better, Sean, but it's like they're a shareholder in this collective group. And so they can like leave and sort of buy, sell their unit, but they're not really selling it. They're, they get their deposit back and then they can move to another unit and then someone else comes in. And part of the reason it's designed that way is that housing isn't a commodity in Vienna. So I think that's really important to understand too. It's not like a commodity like it is in US, right? You start small, you sell it, you buy bigger, you sell it, you buy bigger. And it's also, generates, income for yourself and so that's not how the housing is designed in Vienna. And then I'm going to pass it to Sean to talk about the temporary emergency housing. Our cohort didn't spend a lot on that area.
Yeah, thanks, Lahela. And I think just an added point about the cooperatives is the people who live there are really responsible for everything. Yeah. They're not necessarily hiring a property management firm to do the work. They may hire a bookkeeper essentially, but otherwise they are doing the maintenance of the property really, and everybody has a responsibility within it. We ask questions related to, well, so what if someone who is part of this is not doing their chores, so to speak? And they described it as they don't necessarily kick them out, but they make it known to them that their work is being carried out by others, and there's that kind of social peer pressure that is, as may happen with a small community like that, but it seems to work. On the temporary housing side, this actually speaks a little bit to what Lucky was mentioning a little bit earlier about the citizenship component of being eligible for much of the housing, and that the criteria that they establish for eligibility, there's a whole cohort of folks that are not necessarily eligible for this. So while when it comes to housing need, and if you are a citizen and meet the other criteria, generally it's fairly simple to be able to get access to the social housing. It becomes much more of a challenge if you're not eligible based upon any of that number of criteria. But a large portion of folks are ineligible because they are recent immigrants, or even for refugees, there's challenges for being able to get them housed. Oftentimes in that situation, you have other nonprofits that aren't necessarily plugged into the social housing framework are doing the work of trying to meet those housing challenges and need. So we actually spent time touring one temporary housing development, which was actually built out of containers and redesigned using that. That was for a host of recent immigrants as well as refugees, mostly from East Africa. But that leader of that organization talked about how they are essentially locked out of the system, and they must rely on combination of fundraising, some debt that can be floated based upon the rents that people are maybe able to pay. But they were pointing out that is a cohort of folks that live in Vienna that aren't well served. So it was interesting and similar to what you guys were experiencing and talking to others who are in that space. The next day after we toured that development, we had a meeting with some of the government officials, and we directly asked them about, well, yes, this model of social housing sounds great, but how large is the cohort of people that are not getting served? And surprisingly, they really had no information to be able to present on, yes, even let alone recognizing it. It was a little disconcerting, but I think it's not unusual in some European cultures to see this idea of universalism. So they're just not going to measure demographics. They're not going to look at or see sometimes the disparate needs within their community, because this egalitarian approach to things assumes that everybody is equal and everybody's the same. So it was a little bit eye-opening to realize that there is a substantial portion of the population that isn't getting served very well. And the hope would be that they would, as time would go on, begin to recognize that a little bit more and have more engagement on that side. So a lot of the folks that are needing to have emergency housing are folks that don't meet the criteria for social housing. And at times they are staying, though the folks that we talked to, the owner of one of the properties that we visited, said that the rule is generally a year to 2 years, but you do have some people that are staying longer, and they just allow them to stay longer based upon their needs. So it's not a strict program in that sense. It's really how the nonprofit sees the need and how it addresses it.
Thanks, Sean. One quick thing before I move to the next slide. I just noticed in this picture, you can kind of see in the right corner, it looks like a parking structure there. It reminded me that we didn't mention that public transit is excellent in Vienna, and fewer than half of the residents actually own cars. The city's designed around transit, not around cars, but that's pretty similar to these old, European cities. But one of the neat things is in this structure, this is actually the bikes and rails is in that large structure that was the old rail yard. And the parking structures are all built on the perimeter of the development. They're not built underground, which is incredibly expensive, as you know. They're built on the perimeter, and they're built in such a way that they can actually, if there's less demand for them over the years, which they hope there is, they can actually be actually be converted to residential. So they're designed in a way so they're not, I was looking at them and the floors are all flat, right? They're not angled like our parking structures are here, so that you can actually convert them. At least the ones in this development were like that. And we were talking to the housing authority person, and that's what he was explaining to us, which I thought was kind of interesting. Anything else on that? No. Okay.
So wanted to sort of say that out of our cohort that went last year, there was a large contingent of folks from the state legislature, so both on the Assembly and Senate sides. And out of that, there was some movement from a couple of those folks that were actually on that trip. And Alex Lee kind of led the way by proposing a bill in last session, and he has renewed that by submitting a bill this session as well. So there are a couple measures already underway of the state attempting to see if there's ways to kind of replicate at least some elements of the social housing model for California. So there are basically 3 bills currently in the legislature that are keyed directly towards putting in place some of the tools necessary to carry out kind of a social housing model. The first is the Social Housing Act, which is AB 309, authored by Assemblyman Lee. It builds on the social housing bills proposed in previous sessions. So, a couple of them have been cobbled together in terms of the authority that would be cast in this. In essence, the primary element of it, though, is the creation of a California Housing Authority, which would be a new state entity that would build and acquire housing in order to meet the state's housing production targets. It may be fairly open, but the hope is that it would have the ability to both assemble land and provide financing necessary to build mixed income housing in the vein of how social housing is done in Vienna. Second bill is SB 555, which is from Senator Wahab. That one outlines some general principles around social housing and sets goals, a numerical goal for the state to build social housing units over the next 10 years. The bill also requires state HCD to study the best ways to meet those goals. So it doesn't necessarily have the tools in place, but it sets the stage for essentially planning and development of programs that would then help the state meet some specific targets around the creation of social housing. Last major bill is Labor Force Housing Financing Act, which is SB 584, sponsored by Senator Limon. That one would establish a statewide tax on short-term rentals like Airbnbs. And that tax would then be used to fund the creation of labor force housing, which oftentimes is also called sort of missing middle or workforce, that would have a similar definition to social housing. So the ideal would be is that type of housing could also kind of follow a social housing model. Each of these bills are still active, but in the committee review process. So the first 2 bills, Lee's bill and Wahab's bill, are going before appropriations. There haven't been scheduled yet. And then lastly, Limon's bill is going before revenue and taxation because there is a tax involved there. So that one actually would require a 2/3 majority of the legislature. So, I think in both the Housing Federation as well as us on the statewide level with the Housing Consortium are kind of carefully watching these bills as they progress. But the hope is that these start to be the building blocks for what would be kind of a social housing model and structure here in California.
Is there anything on replicating the model you want to share?
Yeah, so actually, thanks. So some of us that were in the first cohort, primarily us as developers, kind of got together afterwards to try and figure out how could we finance this kind of model here and what would be needed in order for us to to successfully implement something. We kind of worked out what would be kind of a general development plan that could be used, but there would be some key elements that we would need to have in place here in California in order to make it work. First would be, of course, access to land, and currently the way most cities and counties are disposing of land is they must be compliant with the state Surplus Land Act. There are a couple elements to the Surplus Land Act, though, that may be a little bit challenging to being able to implement with a social housing model. So we would need to have some adjustments and probably some carve-outs just specifically for social housing. The thought would also be to try and have the welfare tax exemption. So that's the property tax exemption that affordable housing is available to use. And have that increased from its current 80% of AMI number to 120% of AMI. Other elements would be, of course, the land assembly and the ability, for the localities to be able to assemble land in addition to what they may already own. And then lastly, to probably have some fairly light governmental subsidy program, which HCD and a few others have similar programs that could potentially be used for that. But the hopeful thing is that with that, we could probably end up producing housing that would have an income average of about 80% of AMI, but with a significant portion for extremely low income. And that in essence, the market rate component could help cross-subsidize the middle income component, which is actually the toughest part to help to finance. So some of these needs are articulated in some of the bills that I was mentioning earlier. The welfare tax exemption has been a conversation with the Board of Equalization, who really manages the property taxes and oversees the county assessors in their implementation of those rules. Some of these things are not necessarily easy to come by, but the hope is that with this kind of common agenda, if these things would be put in place, we'd be able to replicate this model.
Great, thank you, Sean. Yeah, so continuing to bring this concept, so encouraging government investment, we're having conversations with the City Council this year going into 2024 that, currently there's zero affordable housing funding in the general fund. And we'd like to have at least a line item, at least a placeholder, start with $5 million so it's there, and then we start flexing that muscle. And as we have more revenue in the city, really start to invest in subsidizing affordable housing, which is what we need, and the middle income housing, frankly. So encouraging government investment, we're continuing to educate. So doing workshops like this same group of the four of us, plus Christina Munn from LaSalle Development, our proposal was accepted to do a workshop at the San Diego Housing Federation Conference, which is October 3rd. And we're going to put in a proposal as well for the RTFH conference in December. We're hoping La Hella gets accepted into that conference. And then the other thing we're doing is looking at policy change opportunities. Are there things we can work with our city council? Are there policy change opportunities at the local level? And as Sean mentioned, there's a lot being done at the state level as well. And what is the role of philanthropy? One thing we've done, because Funders Together is a 501c3 organization, we are allowed to advocate and we are allowed to fund ballot measures. And at our last meeting, we endorsed the San Diego Housing Federation's ballot measure for 2024, which is called Homes for San Diegans. And it's a revenue measure that would bring in an estimate of $200 million a year. And so we endorsed it and we granted funds to the Housing Federation for this ballot measure. So if you are a foundation that is able to do that sort of thing, that is something that you can do to take action to subsidize affordable housing. Another thing you could do is we have a member who actually did some capacity building around some advocacy organizations. So that's also an opportunity that you may have if you want to help advance this work that we're doing. And we'd love your ideas on other ways we can do this.